When my sister, Sukey Finley, gave me the chance to leave with my mother, I knew that she had been reborn as well. However, my mother was a bit hesitant. She glanced at me and, while trying to persuade my sister, said, "Chapman is about your age, so you two may have more in common. Besides, he's studying at Piero Junior High School. Don't you always want to go there?" As in my previous life, my mother only wanted to take away my sister, who was of the right age, to please Chapman Linkletter, her stepson. The Linkletter family was influential and wealthy in the city. My mother's second marriage was a step up the social ladder. After she married into the Linkletter family, she tried her best to curry favor with everyone. She was extremely cautious, fearing that she would lose this hard-won prosperity and fortune. Paul Linkletter, my mother's husband, was a typical male chauvinist, and Chapman didn't like my mother, either. So, compared with me, who was stubborn and rebellious, my sister was a better candidate to live with the Linkletters in my mother's heart. In my previous life, just as my mother had expected, my sister excelled at ingratiating herself with Chapman. However, the more obsequious she was, the more Chapman disliked her. Consequently, she was isolated and bullied at school. Paul had to work day in and day out, paying no attention to the family affairs. My mother, who had gone to great lengths to please everyone in the Linkletter family, was also ignored. I once saw my sister being surrounded and beaten by some girls in an alley. After I rushed over to help her, I advised her to leave the Linkletter family. But at that time, she pushed me away fiercely and said, "I know what you're up to. You want me to go back home so that you can take my place and live the good life in the Linkletter family. Don't even think about it. Even if I'm being bullied in the Linkletter family, it's still better than living like a lowlife." I had no choice but to leave her alone and respect her choice. Later, when my sister turned 18, the Linkletter family arranged for her to marry a rich young man from a well-matched family. Seeing her shine brightly in front of the camera, I thought that this might be the life of the upper class that she had always desired. A few years later, I went to college and caught the fancy of the heir from the most prestigious family in the city. At my wedding to him, I saw my sister and her husband. But she looked at me with fierce jealousy in her eyes. In the corridor, she blocked my way and questioned me why I could live the life of the upper class without having to endure so much humiliation. I looked at her. Even though she was wearing a long-sleeved dress in the sweltering heat of summer, the scars and sores on her body couldn't be hidden. I wanted to comfort her by telling her that my life wasn't as smooth as it seemed. But before I could explain, she pushed me down the stairs. Before I lost consciousness, I heard her shouting in a high-pitched voice, "Go to hell. I'm suffering so much. Why should you be able to marry up and be happy?" Was I happy? She had no idea at all. When I lived with my uncle and his family, my life was worse than that of an animal. I couldn't get enough to eat or wear. Even when I had a high fever of 40 degrees Celsius, I still had to get up at 5 in the morning and cook for the whole family. On New Year's Eve in the cold winter, I was locked outside while the others chatted and laughed inside. I even had to be on guard against the peeping and secretly taking photos by my cousin. Later, realizing that they could make a profit from my photos, my uncle and his wife exploited me even more severely. Even my wedding was a kind of disguised transaction. "So, my dear sister, are you sure you want to give this good fortune to me in this life?" I wondered secretly. I pretended to be at a loss and looked up. In my mother's hesitant gaze, I stepped forward and timidly tugged at the corner of her clothes, asking, "Mom, if my sister isn't going, will both she and I stay with Uncle Frank?" Ruth Quint, my uncle's wife, instantly turned sullen. She blurted out, "We can't have that." It was agreed that only one child would stay with us. "How can you change your mind now?" My uncle, Frank Quint, also looked embarrassed and glanced at my mother, saying, "Naomi, it's not that we don't want to help. You know our situation." As he spoke, he pointed around his house and showed it to my mother, saying, "We're only living in a 3-bedroom apartment." The room prepared for Chelsea was even converted from Fabian's study. There's no space for one more person. Exactly, Fabian is busy preparing for the SAT. He needs a study room. Ruth seized the opportunity to add. I clenched my fists as I listened to them. Although that room was mine in my previous life, my cousin, Fabian Quint's computer desk was never moved away. They just set up a camp bed for me in the room. As a result, whether I was studying or resting in that room, Fabian always occupied the desk and played games. One night, I was even woken up by the sound of pornographic videos from his computer. When I opened my eyes, I saw him putting his hand into his pants while looking at me. I screamed and threw things at him, which alarmed Frank and Ruth. However, Ruth scolded me for being shameless and seducing Fabian. She even slapped me across the face and dragged me out of the house by my hair in the middle of the night. Seeing that my mother still wanted to say something, Ruth stood up all of a sudden, put her hands on her hips, and said firmly, "I don't care. We're not running a charity house. Taking care of a teenager like Fabian is already more than I can handle. You can't just shirk your responsibility and dump everything on us. You're their mother. You have to take one of them with you at least." When my mother heard this, her face turned pale a little. She looked at my sister, and I, too, looked at her. But my sister had already stepped back several feet and said firmly to my mother, "Mom, I really want to stay with Uncle Frank. Although he's not as wealthy as the Linkletters, he won't mistreat me." Frank readily promised, of course. "You're my niece, Sukey. How could I mistreat her?" He said it without the slightest sign of embarrassment. He did keep his promise at first in my previous life. Frank coveted the pension left by my father back then. Plus, my mother promised him that she would give up the right to inherit the Quint family's property if Frank adopted me. At first, he did seem kind to me. He even defended me when he found out that Ruth was being harsh on me. But later, when he noticed that my mother had never come to see me even once, he became bold and completely acquiesced in all of Ruth's actions. Hearing what my sister said, my mother didn't insist anymore. But when she took my hand and walked outside, she still looked at my sister reluctantly. "Sukey, I promise to come back to see you often." My body trembled slightly. My mother didn't say that to me in my previous life. At that time, she just pulled my sister and left without looking back. I, who was only 8 years old, was suddenly left there. Watching them leave, I was at a loss and flustered. So I almost immediately chased after them. But in the end, I could only watch helplessly as they got into the car and drove further and further away. No matter how hard I chased, I couldn't catch up. An indescribable bitterness welled up in my heart. I couldn't help but look back at my sister. There was an uncontrollable look of joy and excitement on her face. It was as if she had already foreseen the dark and miserable future that awaited me. Chapter 2. My mother kept telling me how to behave in the Linkletter family all the way. In general, they could be summed up as, be cautious in words and deeds and act humbly. I could also feel that the closer we got to the Linkletter residence, the more nervous and uneasy my mother became. When the driver parked the car in the garage and we got out, she even grabbed my arm and emphasized, "Chelsea, you mustn't cause any trouble for me in the Linkletter family." Trouble? I didn't know if my mother had said this to my sister in my previous life, but looking at the seriousness and earnestness in my mother's eyes, I suddenly felt sorry for her. When my father was alive, although we weren't rich, our life was simple and happy. No matter how busy my father was, he would always remember to bring gifts for my mother and us when he came back. My mother would always pretend to be annoyed, but her eyes shone with relaxation. But with Paul Linkletter, she always looked anxious and cautious. "Mom, are you happy with Paul?" After living 2 lifetimes, I finally asked the question that I had always wanted to ask. I saw my mother's expression flicker for a moment. She seemed surprised that a child like me would ask such a question. A look of uneasiness flashed across her face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "What do you know about happiness? As long as you behave well in the family and please Paul and Chapman, you'll live a good life in the future." Silently, I followed my mother into the villa. Recalling how crazy and mad my sister had become in my previous life, I doubted that being flattering and well-behaved would be useful. When we entered, dinner was already set on the dining table. Paul was sitting there, looking as imposing as he was in my memory. During dinner, he asked about my school performance. When he learned that I was at the top of my class and had won many domestic awards, he nodded slightly and said, "Piero High School has an auxiliary elementary school." I'll ask someone to handle the transfer procedures for you. I was a bit surprised. After all, I heard that in my previous life, it was only after my mother pleaded several times that my sister got the chance to enter the Piero Junior High School. Hearing Paul's words, my mother subconsciously added, "Since you're handling the transfer procedures, why don't you?" Before she could finish her sentence, she fell silent. She lowered her head and obediently took the bowl from Paul's hand to serve the soup. She forced a smile and continued, "I was thinking that Chelsea hasn't met your brother since you came back. Go and bring some food to him and say hello." As if she didn't see that I had hardly eaten anything yet, she just snatched my plate away, filled a tray with food, and pulled me up. I could see the eagerness and anxiety in her eyes. But I just lowered my eyes and took the tray obediently. The tray was a bit too heavy for an 8-year-old. Although there was an elevator, by the time I reached the 3rd floor, my arms were already sore. Chapman was in the esports room at the end of the 3rd floor. The door was wide open, and I could hear the sound of the game inside. Standing at the door, I simply put the tray on the display cabinet outside. Soon, Chapman noticed me and looked back. Recognizing who I was, he simply told me to get lost. He hated my mother, his stepmother, so naturally, he hated me too. "I brought you food. Get lost." "I don't want it. Take the trash away." The 13-year-old teenage boy was in his rebellious period. Someone on the voice chat seemed to have said something, which made his expression become even uglier. Who else could it be? It's the little rascal brought by Naomi. Just like her mother, she can't wait to please me on the first day. He replied to the person on the other end of the voice chat. I listened in silence. After a while, seeing me still at the door, he became even more irritable. "Get lost. Stop annoying me." Instead of leaving, I carried the tray and went in. He was taken aback for a moment. Thinking that I was going to pester him, he was about to throw a tantrum at me. But suddenly, he saw me sitting at the small table in the room and eating heartily. I was still hungry. Perhaps my behavior was so beyond his expectations that Chapman even forgot he was still in the game. It took him a while to take off his headset and walk towards me. "Are you crazy? How could you eat in my room? My mother asked me to please you. If I can't do it, I'll get scolded. It's better to pretend that you've accepted my goodwill so that I can report back and be done with it." My straightforwardness made Chapman's expression change a few times. I pushed away his pointing finger and said in a childish but calm voice, "I know my place here. I just want a peaceful life. So, let's stay out of each other's way. Don't worry. I won't bother you." While Chapman was silent, I had already finished eating. I cleaned up the mess and carried the tray out. Chapter 3. When my mother saw me coming downstairs with an empty tray, she was quite surprised. She even showed her first genuine smile since she brought me back from my uncle's place. "You did well, Chelsea. You even know how to share my burdens." She reached out to touch my head, but I dodged it. "I'm going to my room." She seemed hurt by my coldness. Her eyes dimmed, and she couldn't help but complain, "Why can't you be close to me as your sister is?" I knew very well that my sister was closer to my mother than I was. My mother also preferred to take my sister with her whenever she went out. It was all because my sister had a sweet tongue and was well-behaved. And I was more like my father, stubborn and reticent. Therefore, when my mother got married into the Linkletter family, she didn't consider me at all. In fact, she almost forgot that she had another daughter in the following years. But my sister refused to come and live with the Linkletters. Out of revenge, I retorted. At that moment, I saw the obvious hurt in my mother's eyes. But I didn't comfort her or take another look at her. I just turned around and left. In my previous life, I might have still had a little bit of attachment to family affection. But in this life, I no longer cared about it. Although the Linkletters were cold and distant to me, they were wealthy. I had my own room and didn't have to worry about food and clothing. There was also a driver who would pick me up and drop me off at school. Piero Affiliated Elementary School was the best elementary school in the whole city. The children who got in were either rich or from noble families. I didn't reveal my relationship with the Linkletter family, so I was regarded as a child of a wealthy merchant from another place who was studying there temporarily. Those children weren't as bad as one might imagine. On the contrary, They were self-disciplined and polite. Even in primary school, they already had a clear plan for their future. They didn't have time to form cliques or bully others. They were busy with all kinds of academic competitions. Even though I had lived 2 lifetimes and had gotten a place in one of the top 9 universities in my previous life, I still couldn't afford to relax in this primary school. After all, any third-grade student could do second-order mathematical modeling. Even Chapman, who seemed a playboy, was among the top students in the junior high school department. I absorbed the knowledge that I couldn't access in my previous life like a sponge. At home, Chapman and I were like strangers even though we lived under the same roof. Every time my mother asked me to show my kindness to Chapman, I pretended to comply but actually didn't. But even so, Chapman didn't seem to hate me as much as he did at first. We lived our own lives without interfering with each other. Unfortunately, something happened that broke the peace. One day, my mother accidentally threw away the keepsake of Chapman's mother as trash. When he discovered it, he was furious, and the situation got out of control. "Chapman, I really didn't do it on purpose. I just wanted to clean your room. That thing looked dirty and broken, so I thought it was trash. I'll apologize to you. Please don't be mad." "Apologize? Can you compensate for it? Who gave you the right to enter my room? If you want to serve someone, just serve my dad. I don't need you here." When I entered the room, the shouting was still going on. Seeing my mother crying pitifully and Chapman fuming with fury, I silently sighed and stepped into the house. When my mother saw me, her eyes brightened up. "Help me, Chelsea. You have a rapport with Chapman. Can you please put in a good word for me? I really didn't know it was his mother's keepsake." "Just shut up. Don't try to sully my mother's reputation. You're just a shameless mistress." Chapman was so angry that his eyes became bloodshot. He clenched his fists tightly, and his muscles were bulging. Although he was just a teenage boy, his height was almost reaching 5.9 feet. His imposing aura made the temperature in the whole living room drop suddenly. None of the servants dared to step forward. My mother just kept crying and didn't dare to refute a word. Under Chapman's oppressive power, she stammered, "I'll kneel to you, okay?" As she said that, she was about to drop on her knees and even pulled me. But I stood still. My mother suddenly got angry. "Chelsea, apologize to Chapman. You will not get up until he forgives you." I thought it was ridiculous. What does this have to do with me? Gazing at my mother's eager eyes, I coldly withdrew my hand. "I won't kneel. Sukey Finley." My mother angrily slapped me across the face and looked at me in disappointment. "Chelsea, how could you be so heartless? You won't even help your mother." The slap immediately gave me a burning pain in my cheek. But I still didn't say a word, just staring at her quietly. Perhaps my calmness made her feel a bit guilty, and she released me for the time being. Averting my gaze, I walked straight up to Chapman. When he saw me coming with the bright finger marks on my face, a flicker of complexity flashed across his eyes. But he still looked irritated and gritted his teeth, saying, "I don't care what you're going to say." I calmly spread out my hand, revealing the old pendant in my palm. That was the keepsake of Chapman's mother, the one that my mother had thrown away as trash. Chapter 4. Silence suddenly prevailed in the room. Chapman was even too shocked to speak. He quickly took the pendant and, after confirming it was real, looked at me with an even more complex expression. "How did you?" "I found it in the trash can," I replied. He finally seemed to notice the dirt on my clothes. He rubbed the pendant, hesitating to speak. "Don't worry, I washed it clean." With that, I smiled and didn't mention that I had rummaged through more than a dozen trash cans and took a shower to get rid of the smell when I came back. I just said casually, "Since it's your mother's keepsake, you should keep it well." When Chapman heard me say this, his face turned cold again. "You may have found it for me, but I won't let your mother off the hook because of this." I replied, "My mother made a mistake. You have the right to hold her accountable. I retrieved the pendant for you just because you said it was your mother's keepsake." After that day, Chapman's attitude towards me seemed to have changed. It was hard to say exactly where the difference was, but the way he looked at me didn't seem as cold as before. When he saw me poring over advanced mathematics books, he would even give me some exercises of the same type. Once, he even came to the primary school department to find me and asked me to go home with him. Since then, the whole school knew that I was his younger sister. That was also the reason why I had a good time throughout primary school and junior high school and made friends there. Sometimes, I was even allowed to meet Chapman's high school friends and have a few jokes with them. Also, because of the experience from my previous life and the fact that I didn't dare to slack off, I always ranked first in my class in the entire junior high school. I didn't know if that was also the reason why Paul became more affectionate towards me. He would ask about my studies during dinner and occasionally give me some pointers. My mother was both delighted and scared about it, and her gaze towards me became even more complicated. After she slapped me, I became even more distant and cold towards her. Sometimes, we didn't even say a word to each other for 10 days or half a month. She tried to ease the relationship several times, but seeing that I was indifferent, she flew into a rage and yelled, "I should have brought your sister in the first place." I knew that she had always been regretful. I had seen her sighing with melancholy many times. But I didn't care. I just secretly guessed when that thing would happen. It happened soon. One night, my mother rushed into my room and yanked me out of my bed, saying that something had happened to my sister. Unsurprised, I got up and went to Frank's house with her. Just as I expected, my sister had also been living in Fabian's study these years. But unlike in my previous life, Frank and Ruth didn't dare to go too far as my mother visited my sister occasionally. They also arranged a bed and a desk for her and even separated her from Fabian's computer desk with a curtain. However, even so, they still had a big row for Fabian occupying her room. My sister also complained to my mother about it. My mother tried to negotiate with Frank, but she was silenced by Ruth's words, "If you have a problem with it, just take her away." Fabian still had the right to enter the study at any time. My sister could only endure the disturbance. A few more years passed, and both of them entered senior high school. High school boys were at the peak of their hormonal development. Just like in my previous life, Fabian was a rascal. He started watching those inappropriate videos on the computer. As he watched, he had evil thoughts. I didn't expect that, unlike in my previous life, he wouldn't solve his problem on his own. Instead, he set his eyes on my sister behind the curtain. Perhaps it was because my sister and Fabian were only a few months apart in age, and she had already grown up, unlike me back then, who was thin and underdeveloped. Fabian actually sneaked onto my sister's bed in the middle of the night. When we arrived, the living room was in a mess. Ruth was grabbing my sister, who was kneeling on the ground, and beating and scolding her frantically. The words she spat out, such as shameless, slut, piece of sh*t, were getting worse and worse. "Ruth, how dare you beat my daughter?" My mother rushed over and pushed Ruth away. Ruth was a shrewd and tough woman. Seeing that it was my mother, she instantly slapped my mother across the face and shouted, "Like mother, like daughter. Your daughter is just as shameless as you. She seduced my son." She seduced him? I thought as I glanced at Fabian, who was sitting on the sofa with a chubby face and a look of indifference. He was still as disgusting as ever. Upon hearing Ruth's accusation, my mother became even angrier. She charged at Ruth and started fighting with her. My mother was slender and had lived in the Linkletter family for many years. How could she be a match for Ruth, a woman who frequented the vegetable market all year round? Soon, she was injured. Ruth pinned her to the ground and slapped her face nonstop. Finally, Frank stepped forward and pulled Ruth away to separate the two of them. "Naomi Linkletter, take your slutty daughter away. She seduced my son. If my son can't get into college, it will be her fault." Ruth kept shouting at my mother and even spit viciously in her direction. My mother was so infuriated that she was shaking all over. She seemed to have never expected that Ruth would distort facts like that and was also caught off guard by her words, not knowing how to respond for a moment. Just when the situation was at a standstill, I spoke up in a calm tone, "Let's call the police." Chapter 5. Who are you to speak? You little liar. If you keep talking nonsense, I'll beat you to death. As soon as Ruth heard what I said, she flew into a rage and glared at me viciously. Even Frank's expression changed. Fabian couldn't pretend that nothing had happened anymore. However, I remained calm. I looked at my mother and took out my phone, saying, "It's an attempted rape." Fabian is already over 16 years old. Even though he's a minor, he still has to bear corresponding criminal liabilities. Even if we're willing to settle this matter, there will still be a criminal record for him. Reporting it to the police is the best way to solve this problem. In that way, Fabian would have a stigma for the rest of his life and wouldn't dare to act recklessly again. I had already made up my mind to make this scumbag pay the price. But just as I was about to call the police, my sister suddenly rushed over and snatched my phone away. "We can't call the police. If we do that, my reputation will be ruined." "How can I be?" I didn't hear the last word, but I could already guess it. It was famous. I stared at my sister's bloodshot eyes, which stared back at me as if I were the enemy who had destroyed her path to stardom, and I was at a loss for words for a moment. I had to respect her choice as I did in my previous life. My mother was hesitant for a moment. After thinking for a while, she suddenly walked up to Frank, grabbed his collar, and threatened, "You must make it up to us. Naomi, let's calm down and talk this out. Don't be mad." I looked at Frank's hypocritical face and knew very well that this man was a complete villain. He relied on Ruth to take the lead while he stayed in the background. Afterward, he would come out to smooth things over. Just like now, his eyes rolled as he removed my mother's hand and smiled, proposing, "I understand that young people can't help having feelings for each other. How about this? We will take responsibility. Why don't we let them be a couple?" "Are you nuts?" Fabian is Sukey's cousin. My mother was so angry that she slapped Frank and cursed, "Thank God nothing really happened this time." Frank Quint, "Don't you think that is disgusting?" Of course, it was disgusting. My stomach churned as well when I heard it. But looking at Frank's hypocritical face, I knew exactly what they were up to. My sister was a charming young lady. The law wouldn't allow her and Fabian to get married even if they were together. As long as Fabian didn't go out of the line, he could toy with my sister openly for a few years. When he got tired of her, he could get rid of her at any time. They knew that we wouldn't dare to tell others about such a thing. So, I felt even more disgusted and indignant. "We won't even accept her even if you're willing to give her to us. Fabian can have any girl he wants. Why would he want your daughter?" Ruth was being difficult. Perhaps my mention of calling the police earlier made her a bit uneasy. She put her hands on her hips, sized up my sister, and pursed her lips, saying, "But since things have come to this, we have no other choice but to go along with what my husband said. All right, it's been a long night. Naomi, why don't you take Chelsea home first? I promise we'll treat Sukey like our own daughter. If Fabian dares to bully her again, I'll break his legs." Frank also nodded and bowed as he made the promise. "Naomi, you've been having a tough time in the Linkletter family. You can't really take Sukey back, can you?" I was amused by his act. Frank and Ruth were clearly treating us like fools. But my mother wasn't stupid. Her eyes immediately welled up with tears as she watched the two of them playing off each other. She looked at my sister and then slapped Frank again. "I won't leave Sukey here so you can continue to abuse her." I stood by and listened. I thought I wouldn't care, but my heart still felt as if it had been pricked by a needle, aching. It turned out that my mother actually cared about her children. However, when I was left with Frank and his family in my previous life, why didn't my mother come and support me unwaveringly? Chapter 6. My sister came back to the Linkletter family with us. Sitting in the passenger seat, from the rearview mirror, I saw my mother holding my sister and crying nonstop. I only felt ironic. "Chelsea, Paul likes you. So can you put in a good word for us when we go back and see if we can let your sister stay here temporarily? She can just stay in your room." My mother suddenly looked at me. At that moment, I saw a look of disbelief flash through my sister's eyes. I didn't care about it, though. After all, everything I had in the Linkletter family in this life was beyond her comprehension. Getting permission for my sister to stay was easy. The Linkletters had no problem feeding one more person. She didn't have to stay in my room, either. Instead, the butler arranged for her to stay in the guest room temporarily. However, my sister's high school was too far from our villa area, and she was in her senior year of high school. So, my mother could only arrange for her to live in school and come back on weekends. Everything went so smoothly. Regretting not bringing my sister here earlier, my mother tried her best to make up for her. At first, her compensation could only be resorted to words. After living with the Linkletter family for so many years, she couldn't even decide on the menu. How could she give her daughter more substantial compensation? I didn't have the time for it, either, because I had already started preparing for college application. When Paul heard about this, he asked me at the dining table, "Are you sure you can make it?" "Not really, but I'm still young. If I fail this time, I can try again. Worst case scenario, I'll just take the SAT." I answered honestly. Upon hearing this, Paul wasn't disappointed. Instead, he showed an approving look and said, "Good. You're ambitious, but you also know when to advance and when to back off. No matter what the result is, there will be a gift for you." You'll get a gift just for saying a few words. Chapman teased me. I gave him a sidelong glance and said, "You can try if you want." "Oh, never mind, you're too old." Chapman was left speechless by my retort, and even Paul burst out laughing. My mother also chimed in with a few words. The atmosphere over dinner was good. I noticed my sister, who was also at the dining table, and her face gradually darkened. "Stop right there." When I was going upstairs, my sister stopped me. I looked up and saw her face filled with malice. I raised my eyebrows slightly and asked knowingly, "What's up?" My provocation made her face even more gloomy. She grabbed my wrist and said through gritted teeth, "How come you could do well in the Linkletter family?" What a laughable question. She was the one who made the choice, and now she was jealous of my good life. I pretended not to understand and said, "What? Mom is also doing well here." "What do you mean by me doing well?" My sister's face became even uglier. She stared at me intently, as if she wanted to find some clue on my face. But after confirming that there was only confusion on my face, she was convinced that she was the only one who had been reborn. "Well, even if you're doing well in the Linkletter family, you'll still end up marrying a violent man in the future." My sister said this proudly as if she was certain that after swapping choices, she could follow my life trajectory and enjoy my wealth and glory. I pursed my lips and listened to her bragging. Then, I kindly reminded her, "You're now in the Linkletter family. Even if you just follow the normal path, you can still live a good life." After all, things were different from the previous life. In this life, both of us were brought to the Linkletter family by our mother. In fact, during my interactions with Paul, I also found that although he was a male chauvinist, he wasn't cold. In my previous life, my mother was just too worried, so she only dared to bring one of us with her. But the fact was, Paul didn't really care if she brought both of us over. My sister was deluded into believing that she was about to become famous and ignored my advice. Instead, she looked at me sinisterly and said, "What do you know? You're living a good life, but I want to live a better life than you." I was silent for a long time and then replied, "Okay, Sukey, may you get what you wish for." When I was admitted to the college, my sister failed the SAT. Nevertheless, she still became popular on the internet because of a single ID photo. Unlike in my previous life, my sister, a high school graduate, was spotted and signed by an entertainment agency, which arranged for her to go to Hagar as a trainee. My mother disapproved of it and hoped that my sister would study for the SAT again. Paul seconded her opinion and said that he could ask his assistant to select several good cram schools for my sister to choose from. But my sister was determined to go her own way. She even spoke rudely to my mother, telling her not to interfere with her choice and not to block her path to fame. My mother had no choice but to agree. On the day she left, my sister showed off to me triumphantly, saying that when she came back, she would marry the heir of the most prestigious family in the city and live a happy life as an upper-class person. I was rendered speechless. In my previous life, among the benefactors I had encountered, many were Hagar plutocrats. They were even more perverted than the big shots in our country, and in Hagar, they were even more unscrupulous. But this time, I didn't offer any extra advice. After all, it was all her choice. My sister never came back in the following years. The entertainment agency guaranteed that she was safe and could only send a video of her to us once a training cycle was over. The agency also showed the certificates to prove they were legitimate. My mother also asked Paul to investigate that agency and felt relieved after confirming everything was fine. In just a few years, I graduated from college with a double degree. Just like Chapman, I was arranged to work in Paul's company. I performed very well at work. A few more years later, Paul entrusted the company to Chapman, and I worked as Chapman's chief secretary and thrived in the workplace. Chapman and I also grew closer and became like real siblings. Soon, he had a girlfriend, and I also met someone who shared the same values. I asked Paul's opinion about my boyfriend, and he thought my boyfriend was a good catch. Then, Paul invited my boyfriend over and started discussing my wedding with him. I was both happy and helpless, and even my mother's eyes became red with emotion, which was a rare sight. As my mother got older over the years and my sister wasn't around, she became more attached to me and always tried to get closer to me, but she didn't know how. I became busier and busier, while Paul had more and more free time. He and my mother could even go on trips occasionally. What happened to Frank and his family? When Fabian was 18 years old, he was expelled from school because of his bad behavior. Later, he developed some bad habits. Frank and Ruth lost a lot of money and even their house for him, but they still couldn't clear their son's debt. And they were beaten up every day. They also thought of turning to my mother for help. But I, who was already an adult, long could deal with these scoundrels. In the end, Frank and his family didn't get anything from us. On their way back, they ran a red light and were hit by a car, leaving Frank paralyzed. Ruth, who had never worked in her life, ended up with a violent son and a disabled husband. Unable to bear the burden, she poisoned the whole family to death. When Chapman told me this news, I calmly explained, I didn't cause the car accident. Just when I thought that I might never see my sister again in this life, she came back. She brought the heir of the most prestigious family in Hagar and said that she was getting married. We hadn't seen each other for years. She had changed a lot. She looked like a doll custom-made in proportion. Her facial features had probably been slightly adjusted and were more delicate than before. And the man from Hagar beside her wasn't bad-looking either. They looked perfect for each other, which made my mother very happy. My sister came back this time specifically to invite our whole family to attend her wedding in Hagar. She also hoped that I could be her bridesmaid. Her eyes were filled with eagerness as she said, "We are sisters. I really hope you can be there on my wedding day." I was silent for a moment. Looking at the man standing beside her, I refused her. My refusal made my mother look very embarrassed. But I was no longer the child who could be manipulated by her. Even if she was angry, she could only try to persuade me. I don't have time for it. I'm very busy at the company. I had a valid reason. My mother had no choice but to let me go. I thought that was the end of it, but my sister came to me. It was the same corridor, the same place at the stairwell as the last time. "Chelsea, why do you refuse to be my bridesmaid? Are you jealous that I'm happier than you?" My sister questioned me viciously, with the veins on her neck bulging. She reached out to grab my collar, but I grabbed her hand in a countermove. "Are you really happy?" I asked in return, my gaze falling on the blue marks on her wrist. I slowly moved closer and asked, "Are you really happy serving one disgusting man after another all these years? You'll marry a pimp and live like this for the next few decades. Do I really need to witness this kind of happiness?" My exposure made my sister's eyes filled with fear. She looked at me in disbelief and shrieked, "How do you know? You've been reborn too." Only at this moment did she finally realize that I had also been reborn. I let go of her hand. "Sukey, these are all your own choices." I gave her a chance and also advised her, but she brought this upon herself. There was nothing I could do about it. My sister did the same thing as in my previous life. Driven by jealousy and anger, she once again chose to push me downstairs. As she did it, she screamed that she wanted to make a different choice. But this time, I was prepared and didn't let her have her way. In the end, my sister was arrested by the police. She was charged with attempted murder. When she was arrested, she kicked up a fuss, shouting that as long as I was dead, everything could start over and she would have another chance to make a different choice. My mother felt very guilty upon hearing it. She thought my sister was talking about how she gave up the opportunity for me back then, so my mother begged me to let my sister off. Chelsea, it was your sister who gave you that opportunity. If it weren't for her, you wouldn't be living such a good life now. She tried to persuade me earnestly. But I just felt sad. Mom, you could have taken both of us to the Linkletter family. It was just because of your own selfishness that you had to choose between me and my sister. So, you're the one who caused all of this. Whether in my previous life or this life, I didn't really hate my sister that much. The source of all this was actually my mother. In my previous life, she chose my sister so as to please the Linkletters. In this life, she chose me because Frank didn't want to raise one more child. So, from beginning to end, the most selfish one was my mother. I watched as my mother's face gradually turned pale and she left in a daze. I felt nothing inside. At least in this life, I had taken control of my own destiny. In the end, my sister wasn't sentenced, but she went crazy and was locked up in a mental hospital forever. The man she brought back from Hagar ran away when my sister was arrested, but he was caught at the airport. He was suspected of doing pornography, and the entertainment agency was also shut down altogether. Later, my sister's nurse told me that she was still making a fuss in the mental hospital, hurting herself every day, and constantly repeating that she wanted to make a different choice. I just listened and smiled, and then transferred the treatment fee for this quarter for her. In this life, things finally turned out well.